Good afternoon to all our delegates and good afternoon to all our speakers. My name is Vivienne Lawack, and it is my pleasure to be the session chair this afternoon within the bigger conference theme of an engaged university from, I'm a member of the Teaching and Learning Strategy Group of USAf, and we are focusing on community engagement this afternoon. We will be having 3 speakers that we will be introducing later. But without further ado, I would like to ask Dr. Noluthando Toni to open the session and to give us a brief introduction on the session. Thank you. Over to you, Dr. Toni.
Thank you, Professor Lawack. Good afternoon, colleagues. Let me start by saying for the past 2 days, or should I say since yesterday, the notion of an engaged university has been interrogated extensively. As the panelists are about to unpack community engagement for the purposes of producing engaged, critical, and democratic graduates, I wish to repeat what has been expressed by many, that higher education is there for public good. What I wish to highlight in my brief remarks is the importance of engaging our students in ways that ignite critical thinking, ways that contribute to responsible citizenry, and ways that transcend disciplines. Since the focus is on community engagement, let us for a minute pay attention to responsible citizenship, as the panelists will discuss other aspects that go with community engagement, critical consciousness, and other factors that are implied in the sub-theme. Living in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic has reinforced previously articulated conceptions of responsible citizenship. Being a responsible citizen covers many areas, and the university has a role to play in most, if not all, of these areas. Some of these are legal obligations, some are social, and some are moral issues. Responsible citizenship is about individuals who realize their obligations to take actions that ensure that their communities are healthy, their communities are safe and secure. Most importantly, responsible citizens participate in their communities to promote personal and public good. We can exercise responsible citizenship by, among other things, seeking understanding of the economic, political, social, and environmental systems, by working towards improvements in various sectors of the society, and identifying and taking action to meet community needs. It takes, colleagues, gatherings and platforms like this one to reinvigorate and foster aspects of responsible citizenship. We also need transgenerational networks to realize the potential of each citizen to contribute positively to society and the role of the university in this process. As I hand over to the session chair, I wish to echo Prof. Wahid's sentiments when he cites Harvey and Knight about the importance of going beyond just producing skilled accolades, but also producing people who can lead, who can produce knowledge, new knowledge, and who can see new problems and imagine new ways of approaching old problems. Over to you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Toni, for that introduction and contextualizing the session for us. Our first speaker will be Mr. Siseko Kumalo. He's a PhD candidate from the University of Pretoria, and he will be addressing us for approximately 20 minutes. Over to you, Mr. Kumalo.
Thanks, Prof. Thank you very much. Begin by giving 2 sort of preambling comments prior to diving into my discussion or into my conversation this afternoon. The first, of course, is to indicate that in most instances, I make this presentation as a village fool who knows that he knows nothing. So if what I say is incomprehensible, I will ask that colleagues forgive me, but at least bear in mind that I speak as a village fool who knows that he knows nothing. Secondarily, I will be speaking today as a student of philosophy, and of course, my remarks will be informed by that. And so to dive into my presentation, colleagues, I do not have a slideshow or a PowerPoint presentation. I will be reading a paper just so that I am conscious of time. My paper this afternoon is titled Pedagogic Obligation in Developing a Decolonial and Contextually Responsive Philosophical Approach. This paper comes from a course that I presented at the University of working with third-year students. And in the course, we read two books. The first is an edited collection which I led, titled Decolonization as Democratization, which was published with the HSRC Press, that brought together both pedagogic experts as well as philosophers in thinking about what it means for us to be confronted by the question of decolonization and decoloniality in South Africa. The second text, of course, is Professor Jonathan Janssen's Decolonization in Universities. And of course, we can understand it necessarily as a sort of education theory text, even though it drew from a series of experts, anthropologists, sociologists, political theorists, etc. And so we put these two books together in the class to really think about this concept of a decolonial and contextually responsive philosophical approach, specifically in the context of the 21st century, whereby our discipline to a certain degree is seen to be losing much of its gravitas in terms of its relevance and responsiveness within society. So I'll start off with just some brief introductions. I'm not going to read the entire paper. I'm also quite grateful to Bowie of Rhodes University, as well as Professor Abraham Olivier of the University of Fort Hare, who have sort of engaged the text and are working with me in terms of preparing the text for review. I'm hoping to submit the text actually quite soon to the British Journal of Philosophy of Education. So with the calls then to decolonize philosophy curriculum and the university more generally in South Africa, which have seen a series of intellectual interventions in the country, the paper takes its cue from Mubongani Nyoga's recommendation when he suggests moving beyond merely thinking about decolonization and actually getting into the work of doing this. And of course, I take this of thinking about a conceptual discipline that thinks through second-order disciplinary questions, right? And the reason why I'm doing this is to demonstrate how we can begin, even from a theoretical perspective, to engage philosophical questions and begin to develop theory. In reflecting on the processes of decolonizing the curriculum, the paper considers the success and failures of a course taught during a global pandemic, wherein pedagogic strategies are constrained. And reflecting on a module taught in the first semester of 2021, I think through the fundamental question that underpins the course, primarily how to develop a contextually responsive philosophical approach on the southernmost tip of the African continent, using two primary texts, my own, Decolonization as Democratization, and Jonathan Janssen's Decolonization and Decolonization Universities. The module analyzed the question by juxtaposing a philosophical and educational text respectively. In this pedagogic autocritique, the instructor reflects on what intellectuals owe to their students in a decolonizing context over the past engaged universities. So I begin by addressing an objection that I anticipate from any well-versed philosopher who's going to say to me, the concept of obligation, specifically in philosophy of education, is one that ought to be sort of relegated to what we understand as basic education. And I begin by setting up the conceptual framework of why I do this work. Right, so let me begin with a conceptual clarification on the uses of obligation in anticipation of an objection that can be put against the concept's use in the work that I develop here. Primarily, I'm concerned with the accountability that checks intellectuals in a post-colony. And here, I'm not assuming that we've already arrived at the post-colony. I trouble the notion full of academic freedom is what has facilitated a disjointed reality between the questions that define the thinking and concerns of philosophers in the South African Academy, and the reality that prevails in the country. So philosophers tend really to sort of preoccupy themselves with high-level theory as opposed to the realities, because of course we say that the realities of society are sociological questions, first-order questions, which we do not concern ourselves with. We rather concern ourselves with secondary, and the kinds of students they produce tend to disregard the reality of the majority for reasons that I expand on in the sections that follow in the paper. Academic freedom as but one factor delimits pedagogic obligation as applicable only to basic education, wherein the subject of the subject, that is, the learner, is still in the process of self-discovery. This is aptly demonstrated by Hannah Arendt when she writes about the crisis in education and theorizes the relationality of the child to education as follows. Thus the child, and I'm quoting here from her, the subject of education has for the educator a double aspect. He, and she uses the concept he, is new in a world that is strange to him, and he is in a process of becoming. He is a new human being, and he is a becoming human being, right? Obligation in this schema is inaugurated by the responsibility that the adults have toward the child, who is the subject of education, a matter that Arendt also aptly and unequivocally frames in the following way. Insofar as the child is not yet acquainted with the world, he must be gradually introduced to it insofar as he is new. Care must be taken that this new thing comes to fruition in relation to the world as it is. Subsequently, without this care, which is demonstrative of a lack of responsibility on the part of those tasked with educating the child, Arendt maintains that the responsibility is not arbitrarily imposed upon educators. It is implicit in the fact that the young are introduced by adults into a continuously changing world. Anyone who refuses to assume joint responsibility for the world should not have children and must not be allowed to take part in educating them. And of course, here she makes a very, very strong claim. This is where I derived then the concept of pedagogic obligation and its uses in my argument, insofar as it pertains to the process of aiding humans on the journey to fully becoming human. This process, it must also be considered as fundamental in a context that is characterized by stark racial inequality along economic and political conditions of possibility. Whiteness, owing to historical reality, is still more advantaged than blackness and indigeneity, even after nearly 3 decades of democracy in this country. The objection then lies in the fact that the university is in service of young adults who, in the Rawtian sense, have fully developed a consciousness that allows them to claim that they have either been socialized into society's values, or have identified rather their own through processes of individuation. And Rawti gives us the schema of the radical left as well as the radical right,
Mr.
socialization
Kumalo,
and individuation.
Mr. Kumalo?
Prof, yes,
Yes, sorry. Can I maybe ask you to go slightly slower, because participants on the live stream are experiencing that your sound is breaking up. So it might help if you go slightly slower. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry to have disrupted you. If you can just pick up where you left off.
Sure. So if the modern intellectual, specifically one who is in the post-colonial context, where the ghost of coloniality still haunts the life potentialities of the polity, is concerned with the function of the university, insofar as we are interested in why it is that we teach and the aims of education, I hold that the notion of obligation continues to have bearing even within the university. So while I appreciate that obligation necessarily has been relegated in philosophy of education to basic education, I say that in the post-colony, where we are interested in the aims of education, I believe that this notion still applies, even within the university. This contention is predicated on the reality that the process of individuation advocated by Rawti's work only truly finds expression in the formative process of knowledge acquisition that takes place in undergraduate education. Here I follow Yunus Balam's contention in his 2021 Academic Freedom Lecture at UCT, that education allows the university graduate to leave this space with a critical awareness of the problems and challenges that plague their society. Education, thusly framed, espouses the value that while the young adult coming into the university might claim that they are individuated, the values they hold are tested, revised, and sedimented in the process of the new worlds that they encounter in the process of reading for their degree. It is for this reason that I am interested in the notion of pedagogic obligation, even within the space of the university, specifically as it pertains to the discipline of philosophy, which by Russell's measure finds its true satisfaction in the engagement of the not self. Put another way, by using the concept of obligation, I am interested in the role of education facilitating within our students the capacity to see the realities of our society for what they are, as racially differentiated, owing to systems of injustice and oppression historically. Through education, are we producing individuals who are concerned with the realities of their fellow citizens, or are we as intellectuals disorienting our students by providing them with philosophical training that is irrelevant to their situated realities? Simply, what question I in the work of philosophizing about their reality? This question is posed since many of the philosophers that are taught in our universities developed their philosophies in response to the social context within which they were located. Consider Kant, Hume, Heidegger, Sartre, and Rawls. The question of obligation becomes central in that our methods of training and producing the next set of philosophers needs to walk the tightrope of being responsive and cognizant of our situatedness, while also bearing in mind the reality of changing global disciplinary trajectories. The secondary concern is centered in recognition of the fact that in responding to local conditions from a place of pedagogic obligation, we ought not to disadvantage our students by creating of them parochial thinkers that are inadequately equipped to deal with the global questions and problems that face us contemporarily. In view of this framework, I sketched the motivations behind such a mode of inquiry. And here I'm going to now, in a way of summating my kind of thinking, I'm going to consider concerning a contextually responsive philosophical approach in the post-colony. Oriented around contemporary trends in philosophy at third-year level, the course sought to give students an insight into the debates that are constitutive of decolonial theory as it specifically plays out in the discipline of philosophy and more broadly in knowledge-making in the global knowledge economy. For this reason, the course drew from traditional philosophical texts, my own, Mabucho More's work, as well as Mudimbe's work, along with texts that take up similar epistemic questions vis-a-vis knowledge-making at the university in South Africa. And of course, here, I just want to make a caveat. I make a distinction between the university in South Africa, the notion of excellence that oftentimes sideline and silence the local context to the extent of inspiring the question that is posed in this paper, which is to say, what obligation do intellectuals owe their students? The latter, on the other hand, that is the South African university, is concerned with both local and global questions and prepares students to grapple with challenges that are faced not only by the local context, but by global communities. More importantly, our graduates can bring novel responses to the global economy on the premise of their having taken seriously the context in which they are located. It is for this reason that the secondary question that is considered deals with a contextually responsive philosophical approach that does not close off our students to the global trajectories of the development of the discipline. So while I'm saying we must use the discipline to respond to local problems, I'm also conscious of the fact that philosophy has global trajectories, and I do not wish to sidestep that. It is my humble submission that what we have, though, in South Africa is a university in South Africa and not a South African university, which subsequently necessitates its decolonization. And of course, while Van der Vlies volume, so this is now to say, so I've indicated that we use both philosophical texts as well as social theory texts. And of course, while Van der Vlies volume on Zoe Wickham's collection of essays, this is now in the social theory text, focuses on the literary scape of South Africa. The objective behind its inclusion was to drive home the salient observation that I diagnose in my review of Zoe Wickham's work as a dearth of imagination that subsequently leads to the death of theory. My review of the collection takes a pointed aim at my own discipline, which is philosophy, which I view as being divorced from the realities of the polity, choosing to concern ourselves as philosophers rather with the intellectual sophistication of abstract theory. While this view might be considered considered rash and misplaced. It is predicated on Wickham's suggestion that, and I quote from her, "We need a radical pedagogy, a level of politicize them into an awareness, not only of power, but also of the equivocal, the ambiguous." This suggestion comes after Wickham poses the salient question concerning the fate of Blackness and indigeneity in a context that has for far too long robbed Blackness of ontological legitimacy, which of course Utendai Sithole calls the ontological density of the Black subject. And there are sort of quibbles around this, this framing that Sithole poses, but I will not get into those right now. Wickham inquires as follows: how will Black people, long accustomed to dispossession and deprivation, adjust to a new condition of not being racial victims? And here I'm beginning to conclude, Session Chair. The combination of philosophical and educational along with social science theory text was deliberate, as suggested by Wickham's recommendation of a radical pedagogy, in that the course sought to answer the question of how to develop a contextually responsive philosophical approach that is one that draws from and responds to local issues that define the lives of contemporary citizens. The aims of the course gave credence to Wickham's inquiry, which is to say that if the scientific system of the country, and more specifically philosophy as discipline, fails to respond to the recognition of the ontological legitimacy of Blackness and indigeneity, how will the majority adjust to the new condition? There is an objection that can be put against Wickham, however, in that her question concedes to the notion of South Africa as a post-colonial context, which I do not believe it is. It's a post-colonial context no longer defined by the majority, that is Blackness and indigeneity, as located at the receiving end of epistemic imposition and cognitive injustice. The reality, of course, is the reverse. Ours is a post-colony and not a seamless post-colony. My objection to Wickham's question is premised on the fact that the majority still exist under conditions of abject poverty, which is itself the result of the continuing rise of racial and economic inequality. Such an observation is what has led to this pedagogic autocritique, which seeks to understand the obligation that the philosopher owes to their students in a decolonizing context. In understanding and exploring this obligation, the reader of the course and this paper will better be positioned to respond to Wickham's question, a question that is itself a political and ontological consideration. I've got 2 minutes remaining, Chair, and I'm wrapping up. Now, further justification for locating philosophical texts in conversation with social science theory is found in Moore's contention when he writes, and I quote, "The debate rages on in the present, involving in the process the exclusions or inclusions of philosophical discourses by self-appointed gatekeepers. These gatekeepers are the many white philosophers across the country who are found in our departments, who are neither conversant with the realities of their students nor the social conditions under which said students exist." Here, it might be useful to mention, even in passing, the focality of language to the extent that it facilitates an awareness of these conditions. Mazisi Gunene puts it eloquently when he writes, "The African philosophical system is not the only one that recognizes two levels in the cosmic order. Nevertheless, in its integrated postulation of phenomena, it is unique and perhaps closer to Eastern perceptions of the world order than those of the Western. Furthermore, and consequently, language must incorporate these realities, sometimes as ritualistic invocations. This suggestion primes our thinking about the role of language in the function of knowledge development and thinking about the task of responding to the realities of the majority insofar as the question is posed, can philosophy have meaning without language? Such a question necessitates that one must answer what language or languages best serve the interests of cultural and social economic development within the African world. In other words, and here this is my final thought, the issue is not language at all, but the philosophies and values that characterize the African world, close quote. And to think about this in some ways as a wrapping up and as an offshoot, this conversation as we're having it between these 2 days takes place after the USAf language colloquia on the language policy framework that took place virtually in collaboration with Stellenbosch last week. And I think it's useful to, as we are thinking about the Engaged University, to think about the tools as well as linguistic tools that the institution has at its disposal in terms of being able to respond to the institution. Thank you, colleague.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kumalo. I'm going to ask our next speaker, Professor Raisuyah. I hope I pronounced it correctly, Bhagwan. She's from the Department of Community Health Sciences at the Durban University of Technology. Thank you. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again, Chair. Warm greetings from the Durban University of Technology. I am Bhagwan from the Faculty of Health Sciences at DUT, and I'm very happy to be part of this very important conference on the Engaged University. When I think of community engagement, I am reminded of Rabindranath Tagore's quote when he said that the soil in which we are born is the soil of our village, the Mother Earth in which we receive our nourishment from day to day. Our educated elite, abstracted from its primal base, wander about in the high heaven of ideas like aimless clouds, far removed from home. If this cloud does not dissolve into a shower of loving service, man's relationship with Mother Earth will never become truly meaningful. The birth of the new democracy almost 2 decades ago brought with it the opportunity to transform pedagogy, to usher in a more democratic and socially just higher education system that would refocus its purpose towards public good. Community engagement began its humble journey into the South African higher education context, supported by USAf, which began to help universities restructure their teaching, learning, and research practices to be more socially responsive and to democratize the knowledge production process. More importantly were the calls made by the Higher Education Quality Committee of the Council on Higher Education for knowledge-based community service, which reflected a deeper need for the co-construction of relevant knowledge that would benefit communities. This was fueled by notions that higher education institutions were being used by the political north to promote their agenda of subjugation, which was meant to obliterate the knowledge that Africa could identify with. Scholars also began to caution about the dangers associated with neoliberalism, saying that many universities had succumbed to the need to commodify knowledge production and promote academic capitalism. Although universities across South Africa began to establish community engagement offices and are implementing an array of engaged methodologies, a recent study found that for some universities, this community interaction has been piecemeal, not systemic, and reflects more individual academic interests. It seems to suggest that engagement is not deep and has not been fully embraced across disciplinary homes and across all faculties at higher education institutions. Some of this malaise may be linked to early criticisms of the university as an ivory tower with black-robed academics who, by virtue of their privileged positions, consider themselves repositories of exclusive knowledge and as such have become increasingly isolated and disconnected from society. Linked to this is also what Benson, Harkavy, and Hartley referred to as disciplinary guildism, or the pressure for academics to pursue narrow disciplinary specialization and seek knowledge for its own sake. This has resulted in scholarly activity that advances theory, but has very little to address pressing social problems. It is not surprising then that such academics view our communities as spaces for fieldwork, as pockets of needs, laboratories for experimentation, or passive recipients of their expertise, instead of being seen as teaching, learning, or research partners. 21st century academic life can therefore no longer be pursued in seclusion, but rather must advance reason and imagination in engagement with the wider society and its problems. Engagement, as Watson argued, implies very strenuous, thoughtful, argumentative interaction with the non-university world in at least 4 spheres: setting university aims, purposes, and priorities, relating teaching and learning to the wider world, the back and forth dialogue between researchers and practitioners, and taking on wider responsibilities as neighbors and citizens. It is these 4 areas that must characterize mutually beneficial partnerships between universities and the societies in which they are situated. Moreover, such engagement must coexist with a vision and which is predicated on the norms and values associated with democracy, reciprocity, diversity, and social inclusion. Engagement by higher education with wider society assumes many forms. It includes engagement with business and industry, with the civic life of the community, with public policy and practice, with artistic, cultural, and sporting life, and with other educational providers in the community. Community engagement also emphasizes the importance of local, national, international communities and industries, and steers the traditional university beyond the position as a generator of workforce and creator of knowledge toward a community-engaged university and as an incubator of cultural and socio-economic vitality. It synergizes the strengths of community, industry, and public service inputs and interweaves them with the intellectual expertise of higher education institutions. In so doing, it positions higher education institutions not as isolated realms of knowledge that creates and transfers information, but as co-partners who work in tandem with wider society. By embracing the social, enterprising, and innovation activities that universities undertake, it is crucial to influencing teaching and research that will create societal benefits. My paper has been divided into 3 discrete, although interrelated sections that move from conceptual issues of community engagement to notions of collaborative engagement, and then an example of how collaborative engagement at the University of Mumbai in India occurred. The following diagram presents some of the concepts embedded in definitions of community engagement. And as you can see, as community engagement gathered momentum, its conceptions have become increasingly diverse. It has centered itself around a diversity of activities, ranging from community-based service learning, volunteering, community-engaged research, the scholarship of engagement, public engagement, capacity building, advocacy, community economic regeneration, and also what has been referred to as the 3rd mission or knowledge transfer. Very briefly, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning stated that the purpose of community engagement rests within a partnership of university knowledge and resources with that of communities. These partnerships must be fully harnessed to enrich scholarship, research, and creative activities, enhance the curriculum, teaching and learning, prepare educated, engaged citizens, strengthen democratic values and civic responsibility, address critical societal issues, and contribute to the public good. Aligned with these definitions of community engagement are descriptions of the engaged university. Holland described the engaged institution as committed to direct interaction with external constituencies and communities through the mutually beneficial exchange, exploration, and application of knowledge, expertise, and information. Similarly, Goddard described it as one which provides opportunities for the society of which it forms. It engages as a whole with its surroundings, not piecemeal. In recent times, certain scholars have, however, been conceptualizing community engagement as more collaborative engagement. As reflected in Table 1, community relationships are premised on reciprocity and are relational, localized, and contextual. Collaborative engagement is premised on a multidirectional flow of knowledge, which means that in a networked society, information is no longer the exclusive domain of experts, and that the most robust forms of knowledge are co-created by a wide range of people. It posits that the university is not an isolated agent of knowledge, generating and transferring information, but acts as a co-agent, working hand in hand with its partners. Collaborative engagement within the university then is part of an ecosystem of knowledge production which addresses community problems with the purpose of advancing a more inclusive, deliberate democracy. It is premised on an authentic respect for the expertise and experience that everyone contributes to education, knowledge generation, and community building. This type of engagement is underpinned by transdisciplinarity. And while interdisciplinary inquiry remains bounded by academic disciplines, transdisciplinarity moves beyond the boundaries of disciplines, integrating knowledge that resides outside the academy with academic knowledge. It is fundamentally different in asserting that the pursuit of knowledge demands engagement, and that the best way to generate socially responsive knowledge is to transcend knowledge bound up within academic disciplines to community-based knowledge. Saltmarsh and his colleagues expressed that collaborative engagement intentionally seeks to address unequal power relations by recognizing diverse expertise and multiple knowledge in collaboration with, rather than for communities as co-educators, co-learners, and co-creators of knowledge. Collaborative engagement dismantles the hierarchies of how knowledge is created and used. It is not dismissive of expert knowledge. On the contrary, it has expertise in solving social problems that is often sought by our communities. However, it is critical of expertise that claims an exclusionary position relative to other forms of knowledge and other knowledge producers. This notion underscores the value of knowledge and experience coming from non-academics and recognizes that in certain circumstances, the expert will be a non-credentialed, non-academic collaborator who are community partners. I have chosen my experience in India with engaged scholar, the late Dr. Puri, to share with you, as it provides a rich example of collaborative engagement. It presents an example of what Saltmarsh described as a localized, relational, practice-based, actively collaborative, experiential, and reflective engagement experience. Social work students from the University of Mumbai, which is located in an urban context, were immersed as part of both a service learning and community-based participatory research initiative in a tribal area outside of Mumbai. This example exemplifies how engagement transcends the boundaries of the classroom and beyond the traditional teacher-learner dichotomy by integrating the full ecology of educational opportunities available to students in a socially excluded geographic area with a marginalized group in India. Learning is often decontextualized or uncoupled from real-world realities. As with the case of the University of Mumbai, if we want students to respond to their call in the world, we need to create opportunities to understand what this involves. This involves deliberating, creating more open-ended spaces between campuses and communities where students and community members are involved in the co-creation of knowledge, and so that there are dramatic shifts in the way they understand ideas of democracy, service, and community. Through a research visit to the institution, I learned that students were first exposed to deliberative conversations in the classroom to understand the tribal community, the social, cultural, and political factors surrounding their marginalization, and the salience of engagement with a view to empowering them as well as learning from them. Hence, classroom-based preparedness focused on understanding the culture, structures, and other dynamics related to deepening an understanding of the root causes of social problems. What this translates to is that beyond the pedagogical processes in the classroom, academics must embed substantive content in courses that will encourage students to conscientize them to issues in their milieu and to work on issues that matter to them. Through immersion in this tribal community, students were able to listen and bring the voices of the community and work collectively with the tribals to consider key community issues and plan interventions with them. Immersion in the tribal community allowed students the opportunity to acquire a deeper sense of tribal life, especially as most students emerge from urban middle-class contexts, with more localized, without exposure to more localized indigenous knowledge. Informal observations and encounters facilitated through community leaders help them to understand the meaning within the conversations, the stories, and traditions of the tribal community. By listening to the stories of tribals, students began to develop a portrait of tribal worldview. Stories as history are vital social and cultural conduits through which students can seamlessly become embedded in a community. Stories exist out there in the world, in the words and histories of people. As Ford said, they are there if we just listen openly and with some humility. Students began by getting an in-depth cognitive map of the physical and psychological geography of the area through immersion in the community. This asset-based approach facilitated a profile of the tribal community and created an understanding of traditional leadership structures which dealt with tribal disputes, a deep sense of community connectedness which allowed tribals to take care of each other, a tribal spiritual system which provided hope to them during difficult times, and an indigenous healthcare system predicated on ancient use of herbs to treat ailments. as relationships strengthened between tribal students, they discovered a lack of access to drinking water in some of the mountainous areas, food deprivation during periods of drought, a lack of for children, and the increasing abuse of alcohol use, which was affecting the family system. This became focal points for advocacy and empowerment of the community to take up issues, as well as working with local tribals on how to tap into their traditional spiritual systems to strengthen family well-being. What emerged through this encounter for me is that the social work theories taught to students had little relevance during students' engagement with the local tribals and in terms of developing interventions. It brought to the fore the importance of indigenous contextually relevant knowledge to guide intervention with marginalized communities. The example from the University of Mumbai highlights the importance of conscientizing students about oppressive dynamics and structural injustice. Through this immersion, students were able to formulate responses to poverty, substance abuse, gender inequalities, and to empowering the tribals while promoting the importance of equality and social change. Service learning and community-based participatory research gives meaning to the experiences of people around us and helps us question the relations of power, domination, and inequality that shape the way knowledge of the world is produced. It creates innovative ways for us as academics to work with community partners as co-learners in the process of change and empower those who have been historically disadvantaged. To leave you, I quote Benson, Harkavy, and Paquette, who rightfully affirmed that for universities and colleges to fulfill their great potential and really contribute to a democracy, a revolution is required. They will have to do things very differently. To become part of the solution, higher education institutions must give their full-hearted, full-minded devotion to the painfully difficult task of transforming themselves into socially responsible, engaged universities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Bhagwan, for your input. You and your colleague, Mr. Kumalo, are actually very lucky because our third speaker is unable to join us this afternoon. So before we go into the Q&A session, I thought I'll just use a few moments to maybe share what we are doing at UWC and picking up from both papers that were trying to make the link between us in the academy, our students, the local realities, and the realities of our students as well as our surrounding communities. So very briefly, I'm very privileged as DVC academic at UWC to actually have community engagement in my portfolio as well. So there's no separation between what happens in the classroom, in a sense, in learning and teaching, even in the way in which we thought about curriculum transformation, how we unpacked what our graduate attributes would be, as well as how would we recognize our staff, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe just a few things of, one of the things was to frame it correctly. I was quite interesting for me when I joined UWC in 2015, how engaged university was, to such an extent that it was probably over-engaged, and there was much more of what I call the soup kitchen approach to community engagement, in the sense of engaging at university, not necessarily at the communities, and not really taking the communities with us, even in the construction of our academic project. And so the first task was to unpack what community engagement would mean for UWC, and that we didn't do in isolation. We worked with our community partners to come up with a set of community engagement principles. And from that, with our community partners, we then set up an annual community engagement colloquium to put it right up there as important as learning and teaching research, and ensuring that what we now talk about is no longer a soup kitchen approach to community engagement, but rather an integrated scholarship of engagement, that where the learning and teaching, whether we're talking about our curriculum, everything, our graduate attributes, everything is actually linked, research linked through the gel. The real connector is, for me anyway, a community engagement. The second thing was to say, besides the colloquium, how do we make sure that academics understand not just the value? So we related it to the transformational goals, those 4 purposes or objectives in the 1997 white paper. And it was interesting, the moment it was linked to promotion, it changed the frame also of the value of community engagement as not something that we do separately, but something that we integrate. And so our third criterion is, of our 5 broad promotion criteria, is to what extent can you demonstrate that you have integrated your community engagement in your learning and teaching and or your research. And so, for example, if a person then says, I teach swimming at a school, and that person is a scientist, it is good. That is an outreach, but that is not the question for promotion. The 4th one was to ensure reward and recognition. And this is the one that I was totally surprised at how much value was, or how the appreciation was when we gave recognition to excellence in community engagement, both at individual level as well as to teams. And how when a person has been awarded those excellence awards, how that actually landed not just in relation to the person, him or herself, but also the community with whom that person, that academic or professional support team has worked. And then to make it overt. 2 ways. One, we've established a community engagement database. So at present, even with COVID, we have 100 community engagement projects across the 7 faculties, including students and including communities. And one of our key principles is that you don't research at the community. Even in the construction of your research questions, the community is actually part of that. And then I think the other one, also to make it very overt, was systematically to craft what we call a SOE, Scholarship of Engagement report, to look at all our research that had a societal, or where communities were involved in the construction of that research, and where there was impact on the community. And that we started last year, and the second one is on its way. But what really struck me was when Ilse Olkers at NMU, when I was still at NMU, used a methodology of, actually she used World Cafe with the Courageous Conversations. I liked it, but we adapted it at UWC for a different purpose, and we called it Courageous Conversations, Cafe Conversations on campus with students and staff, but the one that really helped us in relation to framing community engagement, and it's linked to our graduate attributes and the big link to our intellectual identity at UWC was actually the Courageous Conversations with our alumni. I'd spent about time with approximately 1,000. The last one was with young alumni about 2 weeks ago, 1,000 alumni. And what was very interesting, out of all the things that they said about our intellectual identity, the one thing that came out strongest was UWC's sense of social justice, and the fact that you feel in the DNA that you need to be involved with the community. And that's probably why I found the almost over-involvement initially. And that then became for us something to pause, something to reflect on, to say, but okay, if this is really part of our intellectual identity, and we see this being so embedded in our DNA as UWC, how do we then make sure that from the start when the student comes in, or from the start when a new academic comes in, how do we leverage that so it becomes part of our academic project? And so just at a high level reflection on this, my view is that if we take the community engagement out of the realm of doing good to society, but rather work with society for the public good, and if we think about the kind of realities that our communities find ourselves, in fact, because we're not divorced from that community, I also see the possibility of us as universities, in a sense, being the translators between the local and the global, because of the fact that we can actually, if we can find solutions to our own problems by working with our communities, why should the West, the North, come and try and solve our problems for ourselves? So I do like the fact, Mr. Kumalo, that you were talking about your module, and I realized that you probably were conscious of time. So linking what I've just explained in relation to how we do, how central to what we do, community engagement is at UWC, how would you go about making sure that your module, how do you take your students' realities into account by hearing your students' voices and then connecting them also with your local communities? Can you give us a practical example of how you would go about that?
Thanks for that, Prof. It seems now that I'm not able to share my video, but that's okay. So one of the three things that that I account for in the work that we did with my students, the first of which, of course, is to take into account the language component, which is to say within the classroom space, there's a trans-languaging aspect, right? So a lot of the philosophical concepts that we use can tend to be quite abstract and quite, philosophical. That's philosophy after all. But how then do we translate that and find the necessary vocabulary such that we meet the students in their mother tongue in the first instance? The second, and I think the bandwidth is a bit much on my side, so it's fine if we don't have the video, that's okay. The second thing that we account for, Prof, is also this capacity to then say, how do we pose philosophical questions that concern the lived realities of our communities? So the first, I think, is to take on a Freyrian approach, right? Paulo Freire talks about this idea of problem-posing education, whereby we're able to identify certain problems within our local communities and then respond to those particular problems. Now, of course, there's going to be a challenge here whereby I'm going to get an objection from philosophers who are going to say, once you begin doing that work, you're now doing sociology and you're no longer in philosophy. So the kind of work that we then subsequently do in order to protect ourselves from that kind of objection is to then say, okay, cool, we're going to keep ourselves at the level of concerning ourselves with philosophical problems, right? In aid, for instance, and one of the major things for me that even the course highlighted is to say, how does the philosophy graduate use their training and the skills that they acquire in philosophy in aid of the work that is done by the sociologist in generation of policy, by the political graduate who's also a policy worker possibly, as well as other social community partners, to ask ourselves a meta question around the decolonial, what I'm conceptualizing to be the decolonial problem. And the question, or the decolonial problem here, in my understanding, is whether, for instance, in our use or in our project of decolonizing the university and creating of the university in South Africa, a South African university, does African epistemology give us African problems, or do we use African epistemology in service of answering Western philosophical problems, right? And that then begins to sort of wade through a lot of the issues in terms of taking on this kind of expert approach, going into the community, as you say, kind of working in terms of working, using the community to develop research and doing our own projects as opposed to co-creating knowledge with the community. And that's what my students and I try to do, is to say, can we find new problems, new philosophical problems from African epistemology? And if we can't, what's the problem? Where's the dislocation to a certain degree? Because according to philosophical methodology, in many respects, once you have an epistemology, you're going to have philosophical problems that come up as a result, right? So if you don't have African epistemology giving us African philosophical problems, where's the disjuncture? And for me, that's how we sort of kind of protect ourselves from the accusation to say, you're now kind of bleeding into politics or you're bleeding into sociology and you're no longer doing philosophy. We contain ourselves to that particular project of attempting to kind of use our approach to develop or to try and find African epistemological or philosophical questions, as opposed to using African epistemology in service of answering Western problems. And again, this goes back, Prof, to that statement that I make in the paper, which is to say that in this kind of conscious awareness and in this training, in this form of training, the graduate who comes from a South African university, as opposed to in South Africa, is able to plug into the global knowledge economy and give solutions on the premise of the kind of technicist approach that they've been able to develop in terms of cultivating and really honing in those African philosophical problems. So that for me is that marriage, because I'm also very respectful of my disciplinary ambit. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for that example. I'm actually glad that we got a bit of extra time so that you could take that one a bit further. The question I have for Prof. Bhagwan was the interesting example. The India example is very interesting. Do you perhaps have maybe just one example of how you've done this in our context, maybe in Durban, or how you would like to replicate the experience that those Indian students had and the academic with the communities and understanding those problems, and how would you do that at your university? Yes, we can.
That was a very rich learning experience for me in India. How it works currently in South Africa with both social work and child and youth care students is that we actually place our students in organizations, community organizations, where there's a lot of structure. There are supervisors available to mentor our students, etc. So our students just tend to be exposed to those sorts of environments when they are actually engaging in their fieldwork placements or service learning, or even their community-based research. What I learned from this is that we should now start to exploit our rural spaces. And the National Association for Childcare Workers has made this possible because they're doing a lot of work in rural areas. So what we are considering and what I have been doing is that I've been getting my students to actually start to do their child and youth care work or social work related sort of interventions in those spaces, as opposed to using a traditional community organization out in an urban area. So what we are trying to do is encourage students to actually become immersed in those areas, understand those communities' needs, and start to develop interventions together with those communities. So that was the take-home lesson for me. It's also sort of brought to the fore the importance of our students volunteering, not in urban spaces, not in spaces where there is infrastructure, etc., but actually venturing out into spaces or into areas where they're not aware of maybe culture, tradition, etc., different worldviews, becoming exposed to different realities. So those are some of the things that we've been encouraging our students to do.
Thank you very much, Prof. Bhagwan. There was a question from Colette earlier in our audience. The question is as follows, and any of the two of you can attempt to answer. How can we bring the decolonization of basic education and higher education together? I suppose, Mr. Kumalo, it's probably more directed at you. So if you want to try and respond to that. Thank you, Colette. Thanks,
Prof. To answer the question, I think there was an interesting challenge that was inaugurated by the kind of split between basic and higher education, because it then sort of fragments the scientific system in the country, relegating basic education outside of the scientific system. And at the moment, I'm busy working on a review of Professor Christy Bowie and Sue McKenna's book, the recent one that just came out, titled Understanding Higher Education Alternative Perspectives. And one of the critical things or critical interventions that they make as part of the analysis that they develop in the book is that they appraise some of the challenges or some of the solutions that were thought to be poised to make a useful impact in the sector, and necessarily didn't work out as they had been anticipated. And I think for me, part of it really is, first and foremost, and we're beginning to see this in terms of policy alignment and in terms of policy trajectory, where it's going, whereby we're reviewing, for instance, the language component, both at basic and higher education spaces, in higher education institutions, as well as in our schools. As some of us will note, for instance, there's this kind of trial thing that's being done at the moment where we are introducing Kiswahili in the basic education system. I think from my own position, it would be to, first and foremost, augment and strengthen the work that is being done in terms of indigenous language capacitation, such that our languages can be able to perform and contribute to the scientific system in the country. So that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is, again, to align the two, to see the basic education system as feeding into the broader scientific system of the country and not as a disjointed standalone entity. And I think the moment that that alignment comes into being, the knowledge that we produce as intellectuals, as academics working as practitioners within the sector begins to filter down to the extent that to a certain degree we can begin to kind of streamline students into certain, or learners before they become students, into certain aspects such that they can be able to take up certain questions or certain disciplinary proclivities even before getting into the system. So I think for me, it's really a matter of policy alignment. My own suggestion possibly would be to say that there could be an interesting thing to although I do understand that at the moment with the DSI merging with the DHET, there are a number of policy kind of convergences that are being deliberated on that front, but to remarry basic education with higher education and not to divide the two. I think for me, that's really what's going to facilitate the work that's being done in higher education, trickling down into basic education. Thanks, Prof.
Thanks, Mr. Kumalo. I just want to go through some of the comments that we've received. The one was from Charis, who said, I appreciate the distinction between engagement at the community and and quoting her, taking the community with us. I've really appreciated this distinction during this session and the conference at large. Thank you very much for that, Charis. And then from Amanda, the comment is as follows. It is important for communities to own the solutions rather than having solutions imposed, which reinforces learned helplessness. This approach goes beyond mere buy-in, but empowers for future self-help and autonomy. So thank you very much also, Amanda, for that comment. Professor Zinn, do we have any other comments or questions?
No, there are no other comments or questions. I've posted all of them into your chat room as they've come in. So there's nothing further that's come in.
I think people might be fatigued after a long day of conferencing. And that's probably why we're not seeing a lot of questions. It's not an indication of lack of interest or an indication that the papers were not good papers. I actually want to ask our panelists, so is this something that we should be looking into deeper across the system, maybe for some showcasing of understanding the different approaches to community engagement at different universities? In a sense, just listening to the two of you and knowing my own experience with the community engagement work that we do and how we're integrating it with the rest of our academic project, there almost seems to be a need for a follow-up session to hear what, and yeah, I'm actually talking to our boss here, Dr. Mabizela. Maybe there is something for us at TLSG to also have a look at, and to, in a sense, think about how do we take this conversation further so that we can maybe also amongst each other find out what the approaches are, what the kind of pedagogies are, how do we see, for example, the scholarship of engagement and what theories are they would that be premised on, and what are the kind of practices that universities are doing to ensure that when we say we make a difference, that there is some impact indeed, whether it is, and what measurements do we use? Do we measure against the SDGs? These are just some of the questions that are coming up in my mind. I see in the chat that Dr. Mabezela said, Mr. Kumalo seems respectful of disciplinary boundaries. Yes, I also heard that. Should we be transgressing these artificial boundaries to ensure greater progress? Mr. Kumalo?
Thanks, Prof, and thanks.
Because it's okay. Why can't you be seen as a philosopher with a sociological bent as well?
There are two things, right? Without sort of castigating my own discipline in this country, philosophy in South Africa has really been myopic in certain ways. And I am a very young scholar at the age of 26 who is still thinking about possibly climbing up the ranks to the professoriate in the discipline of philosophy, and also maybe even making an impact in the national system through the National Research Foundation. And I'm cautious of assessors, the professors who sit on those various personal promotions committees, for instance, as well as the NRF, who would be philosophers, whom, when I sort of transgress these disciplinary boundaries, would discipline me because I have not followed the discipline. And this has happened quite systematically, in terms of some of the research that we see happening in philosophy in South Africa in comparison to other countries. So for instance, if you think about the work of Tommy Shelby, for instance, at Harvard University, he is a liberal who works in the field of liberalism, thinking along the lines of Charles Mills as well as Rawls in response to John Rawls' work. Tommy Shelby really kind of thinks in very, very systematic ways, using pop culture. And so one can say that for a certain extent, to a certain degree, he has an anthropological bent, he's got a sociological bent, he's got a political bent, but he is a philosopher and he works in African studies, African-American studies as well. But here at home, the people who sit, the gatekeepers who sit in these bodies and in these institutions, discipline younger scholars. I do not know whether it is because they are threatened by the kind of research that we are doing. I do not know whether it is because they feel that it is not philosophy proper. In the paper itself, I critique my fellow philosophers for doing that kind of work, black and white for that matter, because you do have black philosophers who themselves will regard certain questions as being non-philosophical because they concern certain people's realities in this country. And that's the reason why I am cautious. It's a very selfish thing because I do have ambitions of becoming a professor one day within the sector, but I do believe that there's something to be said about transgressing. Walter Mignolo, in the foreword, or rather in the preface to the book that we did earlier this year, Decolonization as Democratization, necessarily brings that up. He says that disciplinary methodology is itself a trap in most instances. Lewis Gordon calls it disciplinary decadence, whereby as philosophers, we are trapped by this idea that philosophy is the mother of all disciplines, etc. And so, a number of the older scholars, Walter Mignolo, Lewis Gordon, can get to say that. And again, they're not working within the South African context, which again has been very myopic in terms of my own discipline. It really has. And so it's a matter of self.
Can we push you? Can we push you slightly? So these were posted there in the chat. Come on, you are a great scholar. Prof. Denison said, we expect the new generation of scholars to be brave and break new ground, Mr. Kumalo. By complying, are you not perpetuating ways of thinking and being? And from my side, Mr. Kumalo, I've often, because I'm in fintech law and regulation, I've often been told my stuff is more finance or technology than really law. And it doesn't really matter as long as you can construct what it is that you actually profess. So we are, I think if you can take the three comments here, you might want to go back and think, if you are not just falling into the trap of perpetuating those ways of thinking and being like Prof. Zinn is saying.
Well, again, so there are two things here. You know, part of the scholarship that I've developed has done that. So for instance, in working with the Black Archive, I use poetry, literature, and music, as well as art, to think about the philosophical questions that the Black intelligentsia were posing, even as they were excluded outside of the formal knowledge production sites, right? To the extent that, for instance, we find only in the 1980s in this country, even with the raging debates around academic freedom in the former English universities, only in the 1980s does UWC actually espouse the principles of academic freedom and institutional autonomy to the extent that Professor Jakes Gerwel takes on an open admissions policy in open defiance of the apartheid state. So to a certain degree, there are certain people who have been relegated outside of philosophy and not considered philosophers, whom I have indeed taken to be philosophers and to be prosing philosophical questions. So there is that aspect. But then again, let's get back to the practicalities. A 26-year-old who's looking for a job, how does one, because I think it's much more easier now that I'm at Fort Hare, it'll be much more easier to do the naughty work of really transgressing disciplinary boundaries and really doing the exciting work. But now that one has the sense of security, but prior to getting that sense of security, you get to a selections committee, they see your CV and they say, this kid is not in philosophy, this kid is doing something else, he's doing anthropology, he's doing politics, he's doing this, he's doing that, he's doing the other thing. And so you don't get an appointment. And that is very, very frustrating. The precarious life in this country, as one who's just recently sort of escaped that precariousness, is exceptionally excruciating, even as you might be doing the work of producing the research, thinking with colleagues. For instance, the work that there was a paper that I did last year with Imbizo, using the work of the music of Miriam Makeba, Nina Simone, Ledambulu, as well as Busim Mhlongo, thinking about the kinds of feminist questions that their music poses, African philosophical feminist questions, ontological questions that they are posing through their music. So there are the spaces where we get to do that kind of work, but one has to, I think as a young scholar, it's easier for the older generation to say, come now, you can do this kind of stuff. But I think let's just be pragmatic about the prospects of employability.
No, but Mr. Kumalo, see what Colette says. She says, Mr. Kumalo, never be afraid of to voice your opinion. Now you're starting a debate, Mr. Kumalo. We would never consider you a kid unless you seek to take the position of obeying those who are in power. That is a kind of difference that does not speak to scholarly innovators. So whilst you're pondering that, I have a short question for Prof. Bhagwan. Prof. Bhagwan, the model and that what you shared with us in relation to your experience in India, is that something that is replicated or occurs similarly at your university, or if not, is there a possibility of you taking that model into the university much broader?
It hasn't been replicated broadly, but I've taken, how should I say, ideas from it in terms of taking my own students and having them immersed in rural spaces without, academic supervisors, where the community leaders can actually become supervisors of these students as such. That is where I'm going to in terms of my thought with our department. But it hasn't been replicated, across the university. No, I have published a paper on it, and I'm advocating for its consideration in social work education. Yes.
Okay. No, thank you very much for that. Let me just see. I see there is a comment from BB Bowman. Dear colleagues, I do not see much interaction with the support units for CE at universities, and how much work has been contributed by SAHE-CEF in the past. I would advise engagement with Prof. Lawton as the current chairperson. Thank you for that comment. I think our CE units at our universities are all members of that organization. But thank you also for the link that you've sent us, where we can find information about the organization. Before we close, we come back to Mr. Kumalo. You're on the spot.
Thanks, Prof. There was a question that you had raised earlier around a rethinking of community engagement, just joining in with that comment that's just come in. And I think scholarship on community engagement has taken a number of iterative phases, to the extent that, for instance, yesterday in the session that I had, the VC of UWC indicates and uses a very interesting concept, the concept of an anchor institution, UWC envisioning itself and working as an anchor institution. And a lot of that scholarship has emanated in recent years from the global north, specifically in Canada and the United States, where there's that discourse around anchor institutions. And I think to a large extent, we've had the kind of iterative roles of community engagement just being soup kitchens or public outreach programs of institutions. And what I think is an exciting thing, because I will be teaching this course again next year with my third years once again, the new third years that I'll be getting, is that what we're trying to do is that we're trying to get to a point whereby there can actually be substantial theoretical developments that are coming out of community engagement initiatives within institutions, really sort of embedding this notion of an anchor institution whereby knowledge begins to transform, whether it be public governance, if we're working with local and regional municipalities, provincial governments, if we're working with provincial governments in terms of policy implementation, and really thinking about how that particular symbiotic relationship between the knowledge that the university develops and the kinds of initiatives that the institution drives speak to one another. The work that is done at my alma mater, Rhodes University, Dr. Mabizela will be able to attest to this even, is quite similar to that, right? So Rhodes University, I think to a certain degree, leads this country in very, very interesting ways, because they've been able to deepen their sort of clutches into all the faculties across all disciplines, and you've got institutional projects, research projects that are necessarily responding to the immediate concerns of the local communities, as well as the wider regional community within the province of the Eastern Cape. And research, whether it be in commerce, whether it be in the sciences, whether it be in education, or in philosophy for that matter, research begins to respond and answer the biting phenomenological pains of the context in which academics are situated, both within the university, but also within their situational context, i.e. Makanda, Eastern Cape, South Africa. So I think there needs to be a certain conversation indeed around that level of moving forward to that aspect of being able to develop high theory that is responsive at a practical level to sociological and political problems in our society.
Thank you. Prof. Zinn, you indicated there was a question from Prof. Mabizela. I don't see the text of the question.
I'm having difficulty cutting and pasting your comment, Prof. Sizwe. Do you want to just say it out loud?
Yes, I think that would be good.
So maybe he wants to do that?
Yes, Prof.
Thank you very much, Chair. Very briefly, it really is a comment that we should not look at teaching and learning, and we shouldn't look at community engagement as separate and distinct from teaching and learning and research. And I think we should see these as very closely interrelated, and that community engagement in many respects advances the public good purpose and gives effect and substance to the public good purpose of our higher education system. So I just don't want us to stray away and just see it as something completely separate from all the other important functions of our public higher education institutions. Thank you, Chair.
I agree with you, absolutely. That is why I took it back to the 1997 goals. It is absolutely, it is in a sense almost the gel that keeps everything together, if I can put it in that way. Colleagues, if there are no further questions, there is one from Charis. I'm with Mr. Kumalo in relation for the need for pragmatic balance when at the start of a career. There is a whole conversation that we must be having separately. How do you then get to such a pragmatic balance, Charis? Mr. Kumalo, there's someone that agrees with you that at the beginning of your career, you need to have a pragmatic balance.
I completely agree.
And Denise, you in the mentorship space, maybe that is something that one must in our own programs and even at the help program really provide a space for that conversation to be had, because otherwise we become almost followers of the system, and the system decides for us instead of us pushing the system. So maybe I'm also asking you, Denise, and especially also for the women, your world program could be a very interesting topic within the mentorship part to explore.
Indeed, Jay. I think it's a very fitting because I understand the hesitance and what young academics or new academics consider as career limiting decisions, but there is a need for pragmatism, but there's also a need for breaking new boundaries. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting conversation to have, and I'm sure the VCs like Prof. Mabizela and others should would be able to take the lead in advising as well. Thank you.
Thank you. If there are no further questions as I close this session, I would like to thank everyone that participated, Mr. Kumalo and Prof. Bhagwan. You gave us a lot of food for thought. In fact, I would like to ask Prof. Mabizela to flag that we've basically just scratched the surface here. And then there is a need, if we're serious about community engagement being totally integrated in our learning and teaching and totally integrated in our research and not something separately, but that we're really trying to serve the public good, then there are more conversations to be had. And I'm very pleased that community engagement was one of the legs in which one can look at an engaged institution. But I do believe that we were scratching the surface here today, and I hope that whether it's a follow-up higher education conference or whether it is through any of the strategy groups that we maybe, Prof. Mabizela, you put this on the USAf agenda to think of ways in which we can maybe take this further. So with that having been said, Cindy and all the other all the other organizers, thank you very much for making sure that we didn't lose connectivity and that at least we could have a very engaging session. Mr. Kumalo and Prof. Bhagwan, we're looking forward to seeing your published papers on this conference, on your presentation. And I, for one, would be very interested to read your papers, so please do send them on to us as well. With that, colleagues, I then officially close the session. And I would also like, with this, saying thank you, Dr. Noluthando Toni, for providing that input around the response of citizenship. And that is indeed also something that we should be talking about much more. Thank you, colleagues. Take care of yourselves during this COVID-19 pandemic and be safe.
Thank you, Chair.